It all started with a simple fence. A normal wooden fence. Nothing fancy, nothing out of this world. But apparently, for the HOA, it was an affront to public order, an attack on the concept of aesthetic uniformity in the neighborhood. Of course, I only found out when I received a letter from the association, written in that usual arrogant tone. Dear resident, it has been observed that your fence does not conform to the neighborhood guidelines. We request its removal within 30 days in order to maintain the visual harmony of the community. Ah, visual harmony. Every HOA committee's favorite excuse to justify any arbitrary decision. Now, I had already heard stories about these absurd rules. One neighbor had already been fined because his mailbox was a slightly different shade of blue than allowed. Another was forced to remove an entire garden because the plants weren't part of the approved landscape. But my fence? There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. I looked up the regulations and, surprise, it said that fences were allowed. But, according to the text, they had to follow a specific standard that nobody could quite define. It was as if they had purposely left this part vague so that they could fill the residents in whenever they wanted. And who was the president of the HOA? Oh, that's who. The woman who lived next door, always with a notebook in her hand, writing down what each neighbor was doing wrong as if she were on a reality show and the main presenter. Not only did she send these ridiculous notifications, but she also made a point of patrolling the neighborhood. She'd spend the morning walking around, pretending she was just taking a breather. But all it took was for someone to leave their garbage out on the wrong night, and the next day, there'd be a warning in the letterbox. This time, I was the target. After receiving the notice, I did what any sensible person would do. I ignored it completely. After all, my fence had been there for months, and nobody had complained before. It wasn't going to be now that I was simply going to rip it down because someone decided that it bothered the aesthetics of the community. But this woman didn't know how to listen to no. She showed up on my doorstep 3 days later, with her little notebook and that forced smile I already knew well. We haven't removed the fence yet, have we? We. I looked around to see who else was included in this we, but apparently she was referring to me, because I was the only person in that conversation who really mattered. I replied that I was looking into the matter, that I had already seen the rules, and that my fence was within the allowed range. She made a noise with her mouth, a mixture of laughter and contempt, and said that I could analyze as much as I wanted, but that the fence would have to go. And that's when I realized that this wasn't about regulations. It was personal. The weeks passed, and I continued to ignore it. She, on the other hand, stepped up the harassment. Every time I went out to work, there the woman was, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the fence as if it were a crime in progress. I knew she was just waiting for the right moment to strike. And she did. A month later, I received another notice, this time accompanied by an absurd fine for non-compliance with community guidelines. And to make matters worse, the next day, the HOA sent a group of workers to forcibly remove my fence. I woke up to the sound of hammers and saws. I ran outside and saw a group of men dismantling my fence, while that woman watched with her arms crossed, looking like she was about to give a victory speech. You didn't follow the rules, so we had to take action. I stood there watching, holding back the urge to laugh, because while she thought she had won, I was already planning my revenge. She wanted me to remove my fence? Fine. But she never said what I could put up instead. And if this woman thought a simple fence was a problem, little did she know the hell I was about to bring into her life. I could have accepted defeat. I could have simply left my property without a fence, resigned myself to the idea that the HOA was more in charge of my own land than I was, and gotten on with my life. But to accept such humiliation? No, that wasn't going to happen. When that woman stood on the sidewalk, watching my fence being dismantled as if it were a Sunday show, with that smirk of superiority on her face, I made up my mind. If she wanted to force me to take down my fence, I was going to make sure she could never snoop on my life again. After the workmen had finished, I stood there, watching the disgrace. My yard was now completely exposed. I could see straight into her house, just as she now had full view of mine. And that was her mistake, because the moment someone feels too comfortable spying on someone else's life, they need a reminder that they're not welcome. I went into the house, grabbed a piece of paper, and started drawing. In place of the flimsy, discreet fence that once divided our properties, I was going to build a wall. But not just any wall. None of those standard height concrete things you see around. I was going to build a monster, a colossal wall that would turn my property into a private fortress and make her house look like the ugly part of the neighborhood. I started by calling an old acquaintance who worked in construction. I explained my idea, and the man laughed. A 3.5-meter wall? Do you want to protect yourself from neighbors or a nuclear attack? A bit of both. When I gave him the address, he understood everything. That woman's reputation was well known, and instead of trying to convince me to change my mind, he just asked when I wanted to start. Tomorrow. And so it was. The next day, at 6 in the morning, the first concrete trucks arrived. The construction crew started unloading materials, bringing everything needed to build the biggest wall ever seen in a residential area of this size. And that's when the first hysterical scream happened. She came out of the house in a pink robe and slippers, holding a mug of coffee as if she had just woken up and still couldn't believe her eyes. What the hell is going on here? I ignored it. I stood with my arms crossed, watching as the workers began to dig the foundation. The noise of the machines was a delight. When the first concrete blocks were positioned, I realized that she was shaking with rage. "You can't do that!" "Ah, but I could." And I knew she knew it. What pleased me was that she was now realizing that there was nothing she could do to stop it. The HOA had ridiculous regulations for fences, but when it came to walls, the rules were surprisingly more lax. That's because, in most cases, no one is crazy enough to build something that huge in a neighborhood like this. But since I wasn't here to play around, I followed every detail of the building code. Height allowed? Exactly the limit. Materials? Within the norms. Permit? Signed and approved. She tried to reason with the workers, but they were just following orders. I sat on the balcony with a glass of iced tea, watching the scene as if I were in an open-air theater. That's when the real horror show began. First, she called other HOA members for help. 3 of them showed up, all looking uncomfortable. One of the old men tried to talk to me. "Listen, don't you think this is a bit over the top?" I sipped my tea before answering. "It was too much when you destroyed my fence without my permission. Now, I'm just ensuring my privacy." He didn't know what to say, because, deep down, he knew I was right. When the HOA realized that legally it had no way of stopping me, the woman appealed to the last card, the town hall. 2 days later, an inspector showed up, a short guy with a very unfriendly face, who got out of his car with a little notebook in his hand and started talking as if he were giving me an order. "We're here to assess this construction. We've received a complaint that the wall may be in breach of municipal regulations." "Make yourself at home," I replied, smiling. The whole HOA was watching, anxiously waiting for me to be caught by surprise and have to tear everything down. But when the inspector checked the documents, he saw that everything was in compliance. Was the wall ugly? Absolutely. Was it intimidating? Absolutely. But was it legal? Oh, yes. The man flipped through the papers, scratched his head, looked at the structure in progress, and finally sighed. "Well, everything seems to be fine here." Her face was priceless. The inspector took one last look at the wall and left, probably thinking about how some people were too small to deal with real problems. But for me, that was just the beginning, because the wall wasn't complete yet. When the structure was finished, one final detail was missing, something that would ensure that this woman would never forget that she had lost this battle. I had the wall painted. Not white, not gray. No, nothing discreet. I painted it black, like a big monument that looked like a prison wall, completely blocking the view of her house. She tried to appeal to the community look, but guess what? There was nothing in the rules about wall colors. The next morning, when she left the house, all she saw was a huge dark wall, the tomb of her hopes to continue snooping into my life. The wall was finished in record time. The construction crew was efficient, each concrete block stacked like a monument to my exhausted patience. When the last brick was cemented and the paint dried, there it was, a wall 3.5 meters high, completely solid, completely impenetrable, and, best of all, completely legal. The effect was immediate. The next day, the woman came out of the house and was greeted by the sight of nothing, where before she could spy on my yard, snoop on what I did, comment on what I planted or the chairs I put out on the porch, now there was an impassable wall, and it was at that very moment that her breakdown began. For the first few days, she tried to act as if she wasn't bothered. She would pass in front of the wall, glance in disguise, but try to maintain the pose of someone who didn't care. But I knew it was eating her up inside. Then came the first signs of despair. One day, I saw the woman standing on the sidewalk, analyzing the wall like a general assessing a battlefield. First, she tapped her feet a few times on the ground, as if thinking of a way to make me remove it. Then she ran her hand over the black-painted concrete, almost as if she was checking to see if it was real. Yes, it was real, and it was going to stay there forever. That same afternoon, I knew what was coming next. It was the complaints. The HOA started bombarding me with letters and notifications, each one more desperate than the last. First, they tried to say that the color of the wall was excessive. When they realized that there was no rule prohibiting specific colors, they changed their approach to claim that the size was disproportionate to the environment. There was no rule on that either. Desperation grew. Now the HOA was saying that the structure was oppressive, as if that were a valid legal argument. And then, in the absence of a legitimate reason to force me to remove the wall, the woman did what desperate people always do. She went on a sabotage spree. In the dead of night, the attacks began. First, scratches appeared on the wall. Someone, and I didn't even need to be a detective to know who, used a key or a stone to scratch the black paint, trying to leave visible marks. The next day, I painted it all over again, as if nothing had happened. 2 days later, I found broken eggs dripping down the wall, a pathetic attempt at vandalism. I cleaned up calmly, without showing any reaction. But the climax came a week later, when they took a bucket of white paint and threw it at the wall in an attempt to ruin the black paint. And that's when I realized that this woman was destroying herself. She was so consumed with anger at no longer being able to meddle in my life that she had descended to the level of committing cheap vandalism like an angry teenager. That's when I decided it was time to return the favor. The next morning, I woke up very early and installed security cameras pointed directly at the wall. No angle would be left unattended. If anyone got close, I'd have everything on tape, and it didn't take long for the plan to work. That same night, I caught the woman in the act. The images were perfect. There she was, holding a paintbrush and a can of white paint, sneaking down the sidewalk, looking around as if she were taking part in a high-profile crime. But really, she looked more like a cartoon trying to be sneaky. With all the calm in the world, I took the recordings, made some copies, and, the next day, went straight to the police. The HOA may have had power within the neighborhood, but the city's law still held sway. The complaint was accepted. Vandalism. Attempted damage to private property and video evidence. 2 days later, the police knocked on her door. The spectacle was worthy of a movie. I watched it all from my balcony, pretending I was just having my morning coffee, while I watched my neighbor being interrogated on the sidewalk. She tried to deny it, tried to say it was a mistake, but then the police showed the images of the vandalism on the tablet. What happened next was wonderful theater. First, she tried to play the victim, saying that I was stalking her. The police didn't fall for it. Then she tried to blame random teenagers in the neighborhood, but when the recording clearly showed her holding the damn paint can, the excuse died right there. In the end, she had to sign an admission of guilt form and received a hefty fine. But the best part? The HOA could do absolutely nothing to punish me. On the contrary, their image was already so tarnished after this scandal that other residents began to question the real purpose of the association. They had spent years harassing people for badly cut lawns, for non-standard letterboxes, for unregulated decorations. And now they were defending a woman caught red-handed committing vandalism? It wasn't long before the committee began to split internally. Some members left, embarrassed by the scandal. Others wanted to keep up the charade that nothing happened, but the residents' confidence was already shaken. And what about me? I was having a lot of fun watching it all fall apart. The wall was still there, unshakable, while the woman watched her little empire begin to crumble. The wall not only blocked my nosy neighbor's view, it also started a domino effect that I could never have predicted. The HOA, which had previously acted like a small neighborhood dictatorship, began to implode internally. The woman's exposure as a desperate vandal, coupled with the association's wear and tear from years of stupid rules, finally awakened a collective rage in the residents that had been repressed for a long time. The war that began with a simple fence now became a riot against the entire HOA. First, some neighbors began to complain publicly about the constant harassment. The story of the woman trying to destroy my wall spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People who had previously just grumbled quietly were now going after the committee, questioning the validity of ridiculous fines, the excessive spending, and even the HOA's inflated salary for community management. And when there's money involved, there's always dirt hidden. That's when one of the residents, a retired accountant named Frank, decided to take a look at the HOA's finances. And my God, he found some good stuff. The HOA was collecting sky-high fees from all the residents, and, in theory, this money should go towards maintenance, security, and improvements to the neighborhood. But when Frank analyzed the records, there had been no maintenance recorded in recent years. What was there were suspicious payments, obscure transfers, and an administrative expenses fund, which, curiously, seemed to be just a nice way to line the pockets of half a dozen people. Frank, being a stubborn and angry old man, didn't let it go. He printed out all the documents, organized an open meeting, and invited the whole neighborhood. And at the center of the scandal, the woman who tried to destroy my wall. Because, surprise, in addition to being president of the HOA, she was also one of the people who was pocketing money from the fees. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon, in the community hall that the HOA so loved to use to discuss infractions. But this time, they weren't in charge. The room was packed. Residents, some who had never been to a meeting in their lives, were there, furious. Frank took to the stage, grabbed the microphone, and began to unravel every misspent penny, every suspect contract, every invented fine. With each new revelation, the indignation only grew. And the woman? Oh, she was sitting in the front row, in a cold sweat, as she watched her reputation disintegrate in front of everyone. Until, in one glorious moment, Frank pointed directly at her and said, "And here is the person most responsible for all this." The room exploded. People started shouting, demanding explanations, asking where the money went, questioning how she could charge the residents while stealing from them at the same time. And, for the first time since all this began, she had no answer. The woman tried to defend herself, but every word only made the situation worse. She said she didn't know anything, but the documents had her signatures on them. She said that it was an administrative error, but the records showed that the money was going directly into her personal account. The other HOA members, seeing that they were sinking along with her, quickly jumped off the boat. One of them, a man called Richard, even raised his hands and said, "I didn't know that. I only signed the papers she sent me," which meant, in direct translation, "She's alone in this, guys." And that's when things took a turn for the worse. The woman stood up, started shouting that it was all a misunderstanding, that She was trying to help the community, but nobody believed her. The audience turned into a people's court. The shouting increased. The demands began. And then came the final blow. One of the residents filming the meeting took out his cell phone and said, "I've already reported everything to the real estate fraud department. They're going to investigate every penny." The woman's expression died at that moment. No way out, no excuses, no allies. The result? The HOA was dissolved. The scandal was too big to ignore. In less than a month, those responsible were prosecuted. The illegally collected fees had to be returned and, best of all, the neighborhood was finally free of the HOA's dictatorship. And the woman? Well, after being exposed as a fraudster, losing her position as president, and having to pay back a fortune she had already spent, she sold her house and moved to another state. Yes, the queen of rules, the fence-sitter, the #1 snooper ran away from her own mess. And that was the best thing that ever happened to me. And if you agree with me, don't forget to leave your comment and your like below.